and welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Lowell. Today I am joined by two of the people behind Cloven Pine Games. I'm joined by Alexi Sargent and Leah Sargent. Thank you both for coming on today to talk with us.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us on.
In our first segment, what we do is we look back at games that we played in the previous months, say what they are, and then we talk about the one that we played on the Gauntlet. So, Alexi, here we're talking about April. Tell us about your April. What did you play, and what do you want to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lowell. I played some fun games in April. Off the Gauntlet, I played Masks with Family. That's a kind of intermittent campaign with a rotating GM where we've been playing through some masks, and that's a ton of fun. On the Gauntlet, I ran my game Checkpoint Midnight. I played in Brindlewood Bay, run by Jim Crocker. I played in Le Coeur de la Paix, which is one of the expanded reskins of Hearts of Wulin, and Alan Reese was the GM for that. And I played in Apocalypse Keys, something that Jammy is testing. At Gauntlet Community Open Gaming, I also got to do some games. I ran a one-shot of Checkpoint Midnight. I played in Jim Crocker's The Final Rogue, a reskin of The Final Girl, where you are Batman villains attempting a heist while the Batman himself picks you off one by one from the shadows. I ran a one-shot of The Great Soul Train Robbery and a one-shot of Secret Science Sewer Siblings. And the game I want to discuss a little more today is going to be Checkpoint Midnight, a game of mine that's in development and being play-tested in various settings, including the Gauntlet.
I know we've talked about it in passing before, but give us the full rundown. And I know you've had a chance to play it more since the last time we've talked.
That's right. So Checkpoint Midnight, the basic concept is it's a game of supernatural espionage powered by the apocalypse. The players are supernatural operatives running missions and juggling loyalties in the shadows of Cold War Vienna. So I'm currently playtesting it online exclusively, but I hope to playtest it more in person once that becomes possible again. I ran a one-shot of it at Gauntlet Community Open Gaming. I ran a series on the Gauntlet, and I'm running a kind of series with a rotating cast of local players, right? What would have been a face-to-face group if not for the circumstances we all live under.
Does it feel pretty good as a one-shot versus a long shot? Spy games are traditionally a little tough for that unless they're real narrowly mystery-centered. How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be something we come back to during this podcast.
Okay.
I think it doesn't always fire on all cylinders as a one-shot, right? And I'm thinking, what can be done to get the best one-shot out of it, right? But like a lot of games, it shines more in a longer series or in a campaign.
Okay.
Yeah, so what's working for me as I've been running this game, things I've really enjoyed as far as getting to bring Checkpoint Midnight to folks, is that people seem to be very excited by the overall concept of Checkpoint Midnight. Players dove right into the intrigue and the setting, kind of drawing on the geopolitical tensions and the artistic treasures that make Cold War Vienna such a particularly cool place to set a game of supernatural spycraft. One of the other things that's working for me with Checkpoint Midnight is getting the chance to make the play very mission-based. Like Blades in the Dark, and in fact stealing a little bit of tech from Blades in the Dark, the setup involves characters taking on and attempting to complete, missions for and against the different factions in the city. And I found that can work really well with a sort of open table or rotating cast setup where I let players decide out of character what missions they're most interested in, including just using a Google form to sign up for missions. That's what I'm doing with my local group with the rotating cast, so people can pick, are they most excited about the mission where they're trying to solve murders in the Soviet sector of the city? Are they most excited about a mission that involves infiltrating a fancy gala and stealing a fabled sonata? Once they've picked out those missions, we're able to drop right in and kind of use the engagement roll to start the characters off in medias res.
Is the frame that are all the players part of the same organization or different organization? How does that shape and affect the play?
Great question. The characters begin as freelancers.
Okay.
So you are operatives who are willing to work for a number of sides. Your own loyalties are something you're playing closer to the chest, right? Or presumably you're still working out where you fit into this broader scheme. And then as your characters advance in the game, you also get more and more entangled. So you're kind of choosing as you take advancements what entanglements with the Western or Soviet powers you're also taking on, with the end game being you either are able to play the powers against each other and retire to safety, or you end up becoming a fully on-mission asset of the Soviets or of the West.
Okay.
One other thing that's definitely working for me with Checkpoint Midnight is I am glad that I decided to focus on weirder supernatural creatures for this, because there are other vampire spy games out there, some of them quite good. But in Checkpoint Midnight, I've gotten to see players define their takes on a Gorgon racketeer or a Frankenstein Captain America. People have just been really great about leaning into the weirdness and uniqueness of these kind of different monsters I've pulled from Eastern European folklore and other sources in order to populate the shadows of Vienna.
And is this a world where this is all like urban shadows happening in the backdrop, and there's a cloak on this on the real world?
Yeah, there's a masquerade in effect.
Okay.
One of the basic moves is about maintaining your cover, and that applies both for when you're doing spy stuff and when you're doing supernatural stuff that you don't want some mundane person to see.
Okay. Seems like it's going pretty well. And this last time you ran it, what was it? Was it more of the one shot or more of the couple shots to it?
Yeah, I got to run like 4 sessions on the Gauntlet, and there was a bit of a rotating cast because it's an open table as usual, but we had several players stick through the whole time, and we got to see their characters develop and indeed get more entangled and eventually try to untangle themselves from some of the greater powers of the city. We saw someone take on a handler that he despised and then try to kill his handler by the end of the series.
Awesome. Having played Delta Green quite a bit, yes, I know where that comes from, yes. So that sounds good, but you have some things you're maybe a little less certain about right now at this stage?
Indeed. Well, it's a game in playtesting, so I'm still working through it. I could get into the weeds of where I'm fiddling with the phrasing of move triggers, but a couple of the larger things that I definitely want to tinker with as I go forward is character creation is pretty slow, which reduces playtime for a one-shot. So in my guest segment, I'll talk a little bit about some of the thoughts I'm having kind of more generally about how to do speedy character creation and jump right in, especially for one-shots. And then another thing, which is almost an MC note for me on this game, but something that probably would come up for other MCs, is that when someone rolls a miss on the engagement roll, right, when the operatives are setting off and the dice tell you that the mission is going badly for them, I need to be harder about hard framing those missed rolls. Twice people had bad rolls on that, and I kind of chickened out and gave them something that was more like a middling success than a hard miss. But wonderfully, Jim Crocker has run Checkpoint Midnight for me once, and in that one shot, we indeed messed up that mission roll, and so we were in the middle of a firefight when we dropped in. And so I think I need some kind of guidance in the game that like pushes MCs to really pull out all the stops when that happens, because it's more fun when the stakes are allowed to be that high.
Yeah, Blades in the Dark, certainly I have felt that not wanting to pull the trigger when the engagement roll goes terribly there. Yeah, so I get that.
Makes me think there should be some kind of text saying, if no one's firing a gun when the operatives roll a miss on an engagement roll, you're not thinking hard enough here. And then I want to figure out what exactly should happen when you kill your handler. This should obviously come up more if I keep testing this game and people keep getting entangled and trying to disentangle themselves, but I need some more guidance for the MC. That was kind of the culmination of the series I ran on the Gauntlet, but for a longer campaign, I need to think through how that goes, because it's not that easy to get unentangled. Clearly, you're still going to be mixed up with these powers, just there should be some benefit and some consequence for choosing that route.
Yeah, it does seem like a really great opportunity to put some interesting and really hard choices in front of the player.
Yeah, that's the thought. So my takeaway is I'm going to keep developing this game because I'm having lots of fun with it, and players seem to dig it. I get people asking me when I'm going to be running it next all the time.
Oh, good.
And if folks want to learn more about it, you can sign up at bit.ly/checkpointmidnightlist. That's a capital C, a capital M, and a capital L.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to have you back. It seems like you're feeling like it's more complete now, and I'm really glad to hear that.
Absolutely.
Leah, this is the first time I've gotten to talk with you. I know Sherry's had a chance to play with you and really enjoyed it, so this is very exciting.
Well, thank you. I'm a big fan of the Gauntlet and excited to have all three of us on, since I assume some of Beatrice's noises will sneak past the editing.
So tell us about your April.
All right, so I had a medium April with a couple games I ultimately did drop based on baby mood swings, but everything I got to at least start playing was playing Masks with my family in that rotating GM game. I got to play part of a series of Dungeon World on the Gauntlet. I got to play Good Society during Gauntlet Community Open Gaming, which I've been wanting to try for some time, and test driving Apocalypse Keys on what I believe was the first playtest. And it's Apocalypse Keys I really want to get to focus on.
Oh, good. I'm really curious about this.
Well, I had a blast playing it. It's a Hellboy-inspired game where you've got a team of magical misfits doing supernatural mop-up. It's the kind of thing where when you show up, you're not the heroes, you're the people where you're like, well, given our problem, I guess it's good that you're here. So it's a lot of fun. The characters are really torn between their desire to do good, which will cut against their nature or their destiny, because all of them have their powers rooted in dark or untrustworthy sources. And the basic mechanic is that you're constantly acquiring and shedding darkness tokens, where too many of them tips you over into dangerous or predestined behavior, but you're also relying on these to kind of charge up your powers.
So is this a outside belonging game or something else?
Well, I know one of the sources Jemmy was drawing from is actually Brindlewood Bay, because you're solving supernatural mysteries, though you are not a group of lovable old biddies. You are rather, perhaps a storm in human form, the rightful heir of a fairy kingdom, etc. But other than that, rather like Brindlewood Bay, I guess. It also reminds me a bit of some of at least the playbook I played, which was the Pure, reminds me of the Nova from Masks, where you just have an enormous amount of power, and the question is more about how you channel it than whether you can do anything. It's just whether you can manage doing only that thing.
For people who are really into the distinctions among schools of design, it's definitely a Powered by the Apocalypse game, but it's drawing a lot on the game Liberté, which uses kind of black bile tokens that you wager on your rolls.
Jamie is wondrous for putting together all of these things in ways I would never have expected, so they do an amazing job. That sounds so cool. So what about it worked for you?
Well, so some things worked for me from the very beginning. Jamie has great character creation questions where instead of just having a blank for your name, you're picking from a drop-down with things like, your name is a name I need to let go of one day, a name someone else gave me by accident. So immediately as you start brainstorming the characters, you have these really detailed, really flavorful things to latch onto that automatically invite you to expand them in a story. So it's not as though you're playing pre-gens. And the powers themselves really help inform character and story. So I played the Pure, which meant one of the powers I wound up picking on an advance was, you may always choose to give into your power and destroy everything and everyone around you within a 1-mile radius. Only you will survive. So I was gunning hard for that one, and luckily I had a lot of misses and I got it. But even knowing that was on the table for my playbook really helped me decide kind of what character do I want to play. Those things were fantastic. And one thing that was particularly great about our session is it was GM'd by Jamie, since it was an early playtest. And they were really drawing on Filipino folklore specifically. So we've got this modern fantasy, but outside of some of the monsters or challenges that might feel more familiar or played out for a player. And it really felt like a mystery since I wasn't as familiar with lots of these creatures. So as we're uncovering clues, I'm really at the edge of what I know too. It's not like we're like, well, they found a pale body with 2 stab marks on the neck. What could it be? And instead we have people who like bodies split at the waist and have these creepy wings. It's really exciting. And I just love being in an early playtest where the GM is actively encouraging us really in that drive him like you stole him philosophy. My character manages to tip over in only 2 sessions into totally under the sway of the dark by my just charging up my dark tokens too high. And I'm like, yeah, let's just see how that move works for what turns out to be like the very first time in a game. And that's just thrilling to get to play and know that you're hitting this move or outcome for the first time.
That is very cool. It sounds great. Are there some things that you're still a little more uncertain about? I know it's an early play test.
Yeah, it's an early playtest, so some things I'm just excited to see how they develop and change. I'm most curious about how the dark token economy may shift over time, because relative to what I thought going in, it felt more like it was easier to acquire and shed these ominous tokens than I expected. I felt like I had a lot of control over it as the player, because my character's just kind of hitting keys to acquire or lose them. So it was very different than what I kind of expected of a creeping inevitability, something more like the Doomed in Masks or the Corruption track in Urban Shadows. This is not a problem per se, but I'm curious how that will change over time and how that will contribute to the mood. Another thing I kind of just didn't get to try in just a 2-session series, I'm curious about how campaign play will work, especially how Jimmy will wind up bringing in the organization we all work for, because we pretty much ignored that. We were dropped into the Philippines, We're solving a problem. We didn't solve it super well, but we never really had to face the consequences, so we felt more like a group of lone wolves, I'd say.
Okay.
And there are a lot of cool moves Jimmy has written that are about how you interact with the organization that supervises you, and I'd really like to see them go off. I'm also, this is just a personal playstyle thing, more torn about the ultimate Brindlewood Bay inspired mechanic where you solve a mystery by rolling relative to how many clues you have and how hard the mystery is, and the players just put forward a hypothesis, and it turns out to be true or not, depending on how well you roll. And personally, I kind of always feel torn about but maybe I rolled well, but this wasn't the real answer. So that just bothers me a little in my own playstyle, but it's not a big objection to the game.
No, I certainly get that. I'm running Brindlewood Bay, I think, next month, so I'm going to be very curious because I love mysteries, and I like having the little bits out, so I'm going to have to detach a little bit more when I go to do that.
It was certainly a fun element of it because I was in this playtest with Alexi and he wound up making the roll, and his hypothesis didn't match exactly what I thought was going on, but he rolled well and it turned out to be true. But it is interesting seeing the different things even the players make of the situation.
And so your takeaway, having played this first very rough playtest?
I mean, my takeaway is I'd love to play it again in maybe 2 or 3 months, not because there's anything lacking in it now for me having a rip-roaring good time, but I'm just really curious what will shift as people play. It's a really flavorful game, and it just makes it easy to be invested in your characters from the get-go. And I think the other thing I particularly liked is that it just really rewarded gonzo takes on your powers and your prophecies. It's a game where you can just throw out intense images, oh, my character, has these haunting dreams of sphinxes. And in part because of that Brindlewood Bay mechanic at the end, you just don't have to worry as you layer all these things in that any individual participant has a sense of what this is all building to. So I like that it rewards people for just dropping in huge images. It reminds me of Swords Without Master that way, where building up motifs is just really rewarded for everyone.
That was me having those dreams of sphinxes. I was like, we've all seen demon apocalypses and dragon apocalypses, but what about the Sphinx apocalypse?
Not enough of that these days. Well, let me talk about my approaches briefly. Off Gauntlet did 13th Age, Hearts of Wulin with the Supernatural frame, did Monsters a Week with a Hellboy BPRD lens. On Gauntlet did Goblin Court, 2 sessions of that, did 1 session of Dangerous Times. Unfortunately, I had to cancel the second session of that, so I didn't get to kind of see the second half of that. Changing the Lost, Powered by the Apocalypse, finished up Free from the Yoke, and did a session of Hearts of Wulin with the Supernatural frame for GCOG. But what I want to talk about is kind of Gauntlet adjacent because it's something that I'd worked with some Gauntleteers on and we played, and that is I've run several sessions of Star Trek Adventures, which is the game from Modiphius, but with an express version. And this is an adaptation of Star Trek Adventures where I reduced the economy, I cut out all the specialty damage dice, I eliminated GM rolls, I trimmed lots and lots of stuff, and I will probably trim even further. It's something that I talked with Jim Crocker about because Jim Crocker's also running Star Trek Adventures. For him, it was a couple of cuts too far, which I can get, but I suspect there's a middle ground somewhere in there. But I think I'm going to keep leaning onto the cutting more side.
Interesting. Did you end up writing GM moves for it to replace the GM roles that you cut?
What I did was there's a set difficulty number, and I'm using the deck of fate kind of stripped down to say, okay, well, here's the default difficulty is a 2. Let's draw a card and let's see how that gets modified. And just doing it very basically that way, just to keep it as simple as possible.
Cool.
Because otherwise, if you're a GM and you roll, there's a whole set of calculation, roll, figure out if that's actually a success, and then calculating the thing. There are several steps that I'm too old to worry about that stuff at this point. but I'll come back to that a little bit. So one of the things is it worked for me in part because we had been playing Legacy Life Among the Ruins, which is a game I love. I really do. But it's a post-apocalyptic game, and I just didn't have the mental fortitude or emotional strength to play more of that these days. And so we talked about what we wanted to do, and Star Trek somehow came up. All of us were like, yeah, we really want to do that. And I think it kind of came out of the blue. And then all of us said, yes, this is something we want to be playing. Star Trek Adventures I ran before with the Quick Start. It's a 2D20 system. It's got a lot of mechanics to it. I did pre-gen characters before. I wasn't sure about the character creation system, but it's got this very light life path thing. We have to make these choices at the different parts of your life. And then there's a couple of events that you roll. It's not too heavy. It's really got some interesting bits to it, and even though the players came in with strong choices about what they wanted to play, what happened there really informed those and added depth to the characters. So it's a cool thing, and it shows that the Star Trek adventure books, I think, are really good resources in general for this.
When you say it's a lighter life path system, I take it that you can't die during character creation.
You cannot die during character creation. Basically, there are steps, and you have to kind of make a couple of choices at each step. So you get 4 or 5 of those, and then you have to roll 2 events that might be you betrayed your commanding officer, or you did this thing that changed your skill levels up and add reputations and kind of aspects to your character. But no, you can't die.
Not quite a throwback to Traveler, then.
Not full on Traveler.
How do you like that life path mechanic for character creation? I realize I've never played a game that had mechanical teeth to those kind of backstory questions in that big a way.
One of the things that I really like about this version is I'd say about 30 to 40% of your stats and skills are generated by the life path. So you still got a good chunk of that you get to make the choices on. But it does add a thing where, okay, well, I didn't expect that my character was going to have been raised on a spaceship and that they had lived their entire lives on a spaceship. They added some dimensions that really helped flesh out the characters and that everybody was very willing to add into their backstories, which is nice kind of coming in when you got a general sense of your character, but you get these little picks and lists. I'd like to see maybe more of this as some options in some PBTA games to add some flavors, especially where the characters maybe are in kind of a narrow... Everyone's a starship officer, so that's still kind of a narrow track, and this helps differentiate them. What was just dynamite for me, the thing that has made this game a delightful experience, is that we're leaning absolutely into the tropes. I do an opening teaser. We're approaching this as a pilot episode, so we're talking about how people's hair are going to be different when we actually get to the show, and what the special effects budgets are, and how the devices are going to change once we actually get funding for the thing. We frame everything in terms of the show. Like, okay, and here, when you've arrived, you can decide to see this big map painting, and you see the little figures coming in, the starship lands there. At the start of the second and third, I had... Tyler's the captain, so I had him I said, okay, now you have to do this. And Tyler went previously on. And then we did the montage of everybody had to describe what their previously on was at the last episode. And that really helped. And I think some of it came from talking with Rich about Alexi's run of Secret Science Sewer Siblings and leaning into the cartoon nature of that.
Aww.
So we've really leaned hard into it, and it's been great. One of the things is we all know Star Trek, and I'm not sure this would work if people didn't know Star Trek really well. We're all next gen people, and there's a space in the universe, sort of what I call post Wolf 359, after the big Borg attack, when all these ships are destroyed. That's actually where the Deep Space Nine kind of starts 18 months after that, and it's a fruitful place to have a new ship and have it be important. and it's kind of built into the universe. I know Jim's doing something similar like that, so that's fun. Everybody gets to build. We've got an exciting ship. We've got a cool crew. They made up the additional crew members. We had to make up the annoying character who's on board and all of that. And they have a holo doctor who's actually the holo therapist, all of those things. And it's been great. But the thing that has been really satisfying to me is I've forgotten how much I like Star Trek because it's hopeful. I know there's some later Star Trek stuff, some of the things that come in Enterprise, and even some stuff with Picard recently. But there's a genuine optimism and a hope. And even when the Federation has errors, there's a thought that maybe we can live up to them and we can overcome them and things will be better. And that's really good. That's kind of what I needed now. And I think what the players needed. And that's been a delight. All that being said, there are a few things that I'm less sure about. One is that, as I said, this is a game where I say a task. You have to decide two different things that you would be applicable. I'm going to roll my security plus reason. And then you roll a number of dice, but you can also generate additional dice. And you have to roll under that number. And that generates successes. And you compare that to the difficulty number. So there are several steps. So my general instinct is to have people roll less because I don't want to have to go through those calculations. So I may need to go and see how I can cut things down even further. It's also an adaptation of very loose mechanical change where I haven't tried the Starship combat system, and that has a lot of additional like mechanics and subsystems that we're going to have to see how that works with the rules adaptations. Then finally, if someone didn't know Next Generation, if someone didn't know Star Trek, which is certainly possible, well, I don't think what we're doing would be nearly as fun. We're doing a lot of in-jokes. Like it is all in-jokes. It's the kind of thing, like if I were playing with people who did Star Wars and they were talking at this level, I would be like, I am completely lost. I know just enough to fake it, but there's a point at which I have no idea what's going on. Rich kind of skirts that edge for me on Star Wars lore sometimes.
I'll admit, I've played in Star Wars Saturday games where I just have Wikipedia open in a tab and I'm frantically looking things up, and that's worked out okay for me so far.
Mm-hmm. Sherry has done that on her Star Wars things as well, but we know our limits. So overall, my takeaway is I've enjoyed running it. Robert Angus kind of suggested that people play more Star Trek, and I agree with them. Listeners, we're now going to go to our guest segment in which our guest and or guests are going to talk about a topic of their choice.
Hi listeners, we want to let you know that Brindlewood Bay is now available on DriveThruRPG. Brindlewood Bay is a role-playing game about a group of elderly women, members of the local Murder Mavens Mystery Book Club, who frequently find themselves investigating and solving real-life murder mysteries. They become increasingly aware that there are supernatural forces that connect the cases they are working on, and in particular, a cult dedicated to the dark, monstrous aspect of the goddess Persephone will come to vex them. Brindlewood Bay is a cozy crime drama mashed up with Lovecraftian horror. It's Murder, She Wrote meets The Shadow over Innsmouth, and we think you're going to love it. Your download from DriveThru includes the rulebook for Brindlewood Bay, including a version for easy booklet printing, play aids such as the character sheet and dark conspiracy sheet, and 5 mysteries: Dad Overboard, All Hallows Scream, The Great Brindlewood Bay Bake Off, Jingle Bell Shock, and A Murder Most Mucky. We'll be releasing 10 more mysteries over the next few months. Some of these mysteries will be featured in the Codex magazine, and others will be part of a standalone mystery collection coming out in late summer 2020. The first of the new mysteries, Exit Stage Death, will be out this month in Codex Yellow 2, available through the Gauntlet Patreon. So be sure to check out Brindlewood Bay on DriveThruRPG. We'll include a link in the show notes. Thanks.
So, Alexi, what did you want to talk about today?
I'd love to talk about speedy character creation and discovering backstories in play.
Okay.
Because I've been thinking about this. I think this is something to aim for, an ideal to aspire towards, and I'm thinking a little about how to do it.
Okay.
It seems like there's a lot to recommend having, rather than a a complicated backstory you've hashed out that might not see play, being able to hit the ground running and create backstory as needed. The kind of backfilling version of character creation. And there's some games that have built this into their design in clever ways. I recently got a copy of Psyrun by McGay Baker, and that's fantastic. You're all amnesiac when it begins, so you can't have any backstory. Your only backstory is what's kind of suggested by the various questions you've written, and then you play to answer those questions, and depending on how you roll, you might answer those questions or other players might answer those questions. So the whole of backstory is created during play and that you don't need to puzzle anything out beforehand. Brindlewood Bay works a little similarly. At the start, all the characters are elderly women solving mysteries in this town, right? You might think they're pretty similar to each other. Players tend to give them strong personalities, which is wonderful, but you learn more about each of their pasts as the game goes on because there's a flashback mechanic that you sort of use as a cost, right? You can kind of mark these crowns to flashback and see things from your character's past in order to avoid the bad results of a roll. As the character lasts longer, you'll find out more about their backstory, kind of complicate your image of them, and then eventually the character might start marking the more sinister Crown of the Void and get sucked into the Eldritch conspiracy element of Brindlewood Bay. So those are two games to look at that have a great design about revealing backstory during play so that it can be significant. So it's not just something that you dream up on your own that then becomes potentially a distraction from the main action of the game, right? That can happen where a player gets really attached to a backstory that wasn't created in kind of conversation with the actual story playing out at the table.
That their headcanon kind of gets in the way.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's really understandable, right? We like these characters, but if the game can kind of be set up where the backstory comes later, then it's more likely to be relevant. If the game can be set up where the backstory actually comes up during play. Two short games that I wrote sort of use versions of this. I wrote The Great Soul Train Robbery, which is about desperados robbing the train to hell. And you determine just a couple things about your character at the start, and everyone starts out with the same stats even, Lover and Sinner, both at 3. And then as the game unfolds and you use one or the other of those stats, your stats shift. So in some ways, even the stat aspect of character creation can be saved for part of gameplay. And I kind of like that because in real life, we're always creating our characters as we go, aren't we? And then there's a mechanic where you can call for a flashback and kind of move a point from Lover to Sinner by showing how your vices have led you to become this desperado robbing the train to hell. And in Secret Science Sewer Siblings, which is about a found family of sewer mutants trying to rescue their mentor, there is a mechanic for narrating a training montage or a montage about the power of teamwork that can be a flashback, and that kind of refills the team pie, helps you help your fellow players more, but that's something that potentially comes up partway through the game, possibly right before the climax, if it's all right, we got to refill the team pie, let's have our flashback to a training montage at this point. Those are some thoughts, and I'll say that Leah and I are working on a game that'll be coming up in a future issue of Codex magazine called Back Again from the Broken Lands that is all about telling stories, right, and bringing things of your character's backstory in as you play, or you start out without having decided those, and then the mechanics are about telling those stories. But I've been wondering also, how do we incorporate these strengths into other games that haven't been designed with those already as kind of baked-in mechanics, because when you're running a one-shot or a short series, you really do need to make backstory count, and it feels like it'd be better to have it work more like one of these games where backstory comes in as needed in play.
Let me ask you about that,
Yeah.
actually. I think it's a really good point, because one of the things I struggle with when I run sometimes is people make their choices about moves. Then as a GM, I want to make sure that I'm able to play to those moves. Do you think that having that in that quantum state works, or does it put more load on the GM side?
Well, one thing I do at cons that I picked up from Alexi is just when I'm taking notes on all the characters, writing down the moves they've picked and checking them off as they roll them, so that if I'm GMing, I don't have to remember in my head everything about what people have picked, but I can kind of glance down and go, oh, this person has not gotten to steal a weird bit of equipment that doesn't belong to them and use it for no powers, not nearly enough training. So I need to throw more weird things they can pick up into the next scene.
Yeah, so there's the approach of just listening closely during character creation, writing things down. I've tried this a lot just to make sure that those moves don't lie unused. And then the other approach that I haven't tried as much, but I've heard other people talk about, is quantum approach, allowing a lot of these things about the characters to be undetermined till it becomes necessary to determine them. Schrodinger's move, where it's like, yes, you're going to get one move from your playbook, but you can pick which one you want when it comes up in the session. You aren't locked into one right at the start. And that's an interesting one. How many elements that we think you need to work out beforehand can just kind of exist in a quantum state until it's necessary to use them? I'm not saying that should be what you use every time you play, but I think it's worth experimenting with for one-shots or short series, just kind of having some of that flexibility. You might decide which things you care more about, right? Maybe you do want everyone to have picked out moves so you can play to them, but you're okay with letting backstory or bonds or other things kind of develop as play unfolds. Have that be part of what you're playing to find out.
Do you think for those kinds of things where you're talking about filling the backstory or things like that, do we need to provide extra mechanics for it? Do we need to incentivize it? Or do we just need to make that just a part of the play culture?
I think it's worth treating as a tool in our toolbox.
Okay.
It's worth treating as a way to approach, especially running for a convention or running in a setting where you're not going to have a lot of planning time as the GM. You know how we talked about Blades in the Dark earlier and the engagement role where you just launch right in and then players can flashback to establish that they had planned for this all along? What if as GMs we could do that? What if we could just engage as the session starts and then as needed flashback to show we'd planned for this all along, i.e. let someone bring in a move that they have or let someone define a bit of backstory so that their character is more tightly tied into the story unfolding at the table.
When I was running the Ashcan of Rapscallion at PAX, it's a really fun game, but the moves are really dense and there's a lot of them. And I just encouraged all of my players to not read the moves very carefully at all and just pick by what sounded cool and flavorful and tell me, and then we'd address them the first time they came up. But if we tried to learn how they all worked at the beginning, we would never get to play.
That's fair. I've discovered with Hearts of Wulin that the playbook moves don't get hit as much as the base moves, and I'm tempted at cons from now on just to go, what's your playbook? Here's your roll move. You can pick your other moves as we go along. And that will probably solve the problem of people going, I didn't get to use this. Yeah. Anything else you want to say about this, Alexi?
No, but it's going to be something on my mind as I run and as I design games, because I do think there's a real need for games that are able to hit the ground fast.
So Leah, what did you want to talk about today?
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about running high-concept mask games, because I've had a lot of fun doing it.
Okay.
I got to run at Gen Con a game where our superheroes were all stuck in a time loop, and that was kind of an unchosen game. I just signed up to run Masks for Magpie, and then, some say given concepts like, open your story with everyone at the base of a building that's just fallen down and they're blamed. I'm like, cool, I can do that. Then that year they're like, okay, your prompt is, your players are stuck in a time loop. And I'm like, okay, is there any other guidance about that? And they're like, no. So that was a lot of fun. And then I also ran deliberately a game on the Gauntlet that was a body swapping episode of Masks. And so in both cases, I kind of had a big question about how much mechanics do I need to run something this insane? And with the time loop, I was thinking about a bunch of things like, do I want a custom roll for, when they hit the end of a loop and then have to start over? And if so, how should that work? I ultimately didn't do that because I thought it was kind of the wrong choice for a con game where people have signed up. They've maybe seen the one sentence prompt, but they're signing up to learn the core game. And introducing a custom move distracts them from test driving, especially in the Magpie official room at a Magpie official game, what the product actually is. So that left me kind of, how do I give the flavor without any actual mechanical support in the game for this? And what I went with was mostly leaning on having a set of leading questions kind of inspired by Dread that I had written out a whole menu of and figured out which should go to which character as people did character creation. And it's things like, what did you buy during this loop, knowing that you'll never have to pay the credit card bill because you're assuming you'll keep looping? What text message do you keep not sending, even though you know it won't count, but you are tempted every loop right at the end?
Oh, that's really good.
And just to really build up that sense of you've been doing this often enough to have routines, something you've exhausted as a fun thing to do during being stuck in a loop. and trying to make them really play into the character. So we had a Janice who had financial problems, and that's why that was the person I asked about what did you buy that, you definitely shouldn't. And then, I wanted that sense of you've been doing this for a while. So I just had them at the beginning have one player roll 2d6 to tell us what number loop we were on so far, since they'd realized. And it turned out it was loop 10. We, set the scene where they're meeting and, have a few details of like the coffee cup that someone catches in the coffee shop because they've seen someone knock it down so many times. And we montage through the villains that they'd eliminated as the source of the time loop by me just fanning out the deck of villainy and having them pick. And then we'd be like, oh yeah, and on loop 3, you ruled out this character who turned out with her army of squirrels not to have anything to do with this.
Oh, so good.
Ultimately, they only looped once in play. I didn't have that much of a plan for how this would work. I figured at any point someone would be like, all right, like we give up, we want to loop again. I'd be like, sure. And then play it as it laid, possibly making just a fortune roll for how well it had been as they kind of fast forward to the point where things went really wrong. But what ultimately happened is they'd gone through a single loop, mostly doing okay, but with one really catastrophic mistake, at least in the eyes of the character played by Alexi, who was at my table, who had released a dangerous mutagen into the town water supply by tackling someone ineptly.
Hey.
And so he was really invested in not finishing on that loop, and ultimately used a moment of truth.
Yeah. I was playing the Legacy, and his family's greatest foe had, accidentally been put into the water supply. So he's like, no, we can't end on this loop. We have to loop one more time.
Oh, nice.
But I had no plans for the mechanics or even exactly what was the cause of the loop or how to fix it. I just had scribbled notes that said, like, a loop, someone inside it may be relevant to the team. And then as I did character creation, I decided it was the Legacy's younger sister, who was older than him by that point, having been aged up in order to sign the consent forms to go on this like complicated time adventure.
Oh, nice. And you did a similar thing with the body swap, or did that take a different tack?
So with the body swap, everyone had signed up for that specifically on the Gauntlet, and I had a little more room to talk to people before the game about what the mechanics would look like. And the biggest question from my point of view was how to be true to kind of the core of what this feels like. And I was always focused on more of an in-person idea of how this game worked, even though I was running it online, which is that when characters swap bodies, they should all be, like, there should be a moment where everyone goes, oh no, it's happened, and then, like, physically passes playbooks around the table. So you definitely get access to the powers of your new playbook, but we had a bit of a discussion about should you carry over your old stats because you're you
Oh, wow.
in this new body, or stick with the playbook you're getting. And ultimately, we went with the stats that matched the playbook of the person you'd been swapped into, going with, in Masks, stats are about how people see you, plus the moves are kind of geared towards the stats you're starting with.
Yeah.
So to come in with a -2 superior and a superior relying playbook is hard. But you're carrying over your own XP, you carry over your own conditions, we decided. And then, of course, when they did, in fact, successfully swap back, the person is stuck with their labels as you've caused them to shift. So that was a lot of fun. And again, no real plan when we started about mechanically what exactly would cause the shift or how they could shift back. It was up to the players to kind of assess the situation, use other moves to put that together. What was the most fun for me was looking at how a shift could kind of pull on the core questions of each playbook. And as it happened, I had one person drop out. I thought I had 4 people. I had 3. So I had to kind of cycle the folks.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a transformed, a delinquent, and an outsider. And so my biggest question was where to shift the transformed. Like someone whose whole thing is they don't look normal anymore. They're sad. Should they go to the alien and still be different even when body swapped? And I ultimately pushed her into the delinquent. So on the one hand, she was normal again. But on the other hand, our delinquent, again, Alexi, had decided his form of delinquency was a kind of extreme, abrasive libertarianism. And our transformed, had gone from one kind of way she was repelling others to a new kind and kept trying to, both not get caught having switched. They were on their last legs with Aegis, some slightly contrived reason they didn't want to come clean about this.
Mm-hmm.
Also trying to teach him how to be a better person as she saw it. And meanwhile, the alien is the transformed. It's just like, yes, this is what humans are also like. This is the range of humans.
Awesome. So that went pretty well. You're pretty happy with how that ended up?
I think both times were a blast. It helps having players who are just really game for the concept. And it honestly left me feeling like it's okay to jump into a high concept without an enormous plan and without as much mechanical support as you would have if the game were wholly about that concept, as a system.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a good base game, then it's fine to just throw the characters into a weirder scenario as long as everyone's comfortable that there isn't a rule book, that you won't be able to look things up as you go, but you're all going to follow the fiction and go, okay, I think in these circumstances, I'm going to have to ask you to do this.
So let me ask you, do you have another high concept masks thing that you're thinking about that you'd like to do?
The next high concept thing I want to do is just running like a 3-shot that's going to be in different systems every time. And I'm still working on what that would be. And I've kind of put my most ambitious plans on ice until someone has a more reliable nap schedule.
Oh, that makes sense.
But I keep, as I play games, keep going like, okay, could these guys chain together?
There's always Mask's musical episode, if you want to give that a shot.
You did do that in our home campaign.
Rich has talked about for the whenever you have to do a holodeck adventure in the Star Trek game is we have to play it in a different system in a different game. So that fits as the bottle episode for that.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah. If your Star Trek characters are gonna hang out on the Wild West holodeck simulation, you got to pull out Dust Devils or something.
I was very tempted to, when we had our more than a year mask campaign, to run one session in Dread as kind of Buffy-style dreamscape where people really could get picked off one by one.
Oh,
and as long as one person survived the adventure, they'd all be able to wake up. I'd be a little stuck if I managed to kill off all of them. Didn't ultimately come to fruition, but it's a fun system, I think, to drop into an ongoing campaign in that way.
That's a really good idea. Well, let's move to our last segment. Listeners, in our final segment, we have each of us talk about what is just something small that is giving us life. So, Alexi, what is giving you life?
What's giving me life is the just-released Magic set Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths. So this is the most recent Magic the Gathering expansion. Just came out, and I was able to find a friendly local game store doing curbside pickup, where I could just go and pick up 2 pre-release packs, and then bring them back and play some Ikoria, build some decks, and mutate some monsters, and have a grand old time.
What is the theme of Ikoria? I'm not familiar with that one.
Oh yeah, it is a plane all about giant monsters.
Oh.
They even have a special promotion where some of the cards have been printed with alternate Godzilla-themed art. But yeah, it's kind of Godzilla meets Magic the Gathering.
Oh, that is wondrous. Leah, what is giving you life?
I've been really enjoying following Robin Sloan's development diary for a new video game he's working on. Robin Sloan is a real polymath in his creative endeavors. He's the author of Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore and Sourdough, which is a novel, not just a recipe book. And he's been blogging through his game Overworld, and has just come up with the core mechanic. It's a choose-your-own-adventure kind of game, with the tension being, how do you both not die on your adventures, but also, the other peril, not become attached to the towns through which you journey, so you just wind up becoming the village blacksmith. And he wants to make that, kind of a very compelling threat. Oh yeah, Alexi runs the perils of the overworld. And he's talked about map design, but the best thing is, in his most recent update, how do you kind of take a choose-your-own-adventure so that there's a degree of randomness and risk? He's decided to use the mechanics of blackjack.
Oh, interesting.
You're kind of deciding how many adventurous things to do in each town. That's essentially dealing you a card, just like in blackjack. It gets you up to a total. You decide after 2, do you want to hit again? Is your total a little too low? And then do one more adventurous thing or one more homebody-ish thing. You're altering your score. And then the game itself is drawing cards opposing you. And it's that combination of whether you beat the GM, whether you go over and break the bank, that's kind of determining how you're forming your character. Because Robin didn't like the way that some choose-your-own-adventures, it's easy to predict which is the right choice or how they cash out, kind of the way that a lot of online sorting quizzes make it really obvious which house is which.
Mm-hmm.
And this way you've got a real way to be risky. And so I love it. What a great repurposing of one game into another.
Oh, that sounds very cool. For me, Sherry's been playing Persona 5 Royal on the PlayStation, and I went back and I'm replaying Persona 3 Portable on the little PlayStation TV thing I've got hooked up, and it is super lo-fi. And it reminds me of everything I love about that game. I've been able to mindlessly do random battles in a big tower, and that has been very calming. I kind of dig that right now. Listeners, that is our show. The Gauntlet Podcast is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find all of our podcasts and more information about everything that we do at gauntlet-rpg.com. You can follow us or contact us via Twitter at GauntletRPG. I encourage you to check that out, as well as our Patreon, which has several different levels, and we've just put out a new volume of our zine associated with the Patreon called Codex. So lots of exciting things there. Alexi and Leah and Beatrice, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
It's been a pleasure, a slightly noisy pleasure.
And that's our show.